Hello everyone and welcome to this Dom Labs tutorial. In this tutorial I'm going to be teaching you how to add weapons to your Vampire Survivors like clone. First we are going to have to create a weapon data script. So let's create a new MonoBehavior script and name it weapon data. Then we can open up this script in our Toys of Coding editor. I'm going to open it up in Microsoft Visual Studio. And this script will not be like our normal scripts. Instead of being a MonoBehavior script, we're going to make it a scriptable object, which means we have to have a create asset menu with menu name as weapon. This just creates a little a menu so that we can create our own weapons. So I'm going to delete this start and update methods and create a few different fields. The first field is going to be a string and I'm going to name it weapon name. The next is going to be a game object and I'm going to name this prefab. The next is going to be a float. I'm going to name this damage. The next is going to be a float. I'm going to name it speed. The next is going to be another float, and it's going to be cooldown. And then I'm going to have another public int, and I'm going to name it projectiles per shot. So now we can create our own weapons. So let's go back inside of the Unity editor, and once we're in the Unity editor, if we click create, I can click weapon, and it will create a new weapon. I'm just going to right now name this sword. For the weapon name, I can put sword. For the damage, I will put 2. For the speed, I will put 10. For the cooldown, I'll put 1. And then projectiles per shot, I will also put 1. Now, for the prefab, I'm going to create a 2D object, sprite square. I'm going to name this sword. And then for the sprite, I'm going to look for sword and choose this sword. So if I zoom in and set the order in layer to 1, we can see that that's what the sword looks like. And I'm going to create a prefab out of it. So I'm going to drag into the prefab, delete it in our hierarchy, and for the sword, drag this prefab into the prefab slot. Now we need to have a weapon class so that it can spawn our weapons. So let's create a new MonoBehavior script, and I'm going to name it weapon. Then let's open up this script, and then this is not going to inherit from MonoBehavior because we are not going to be needing it on a certain game object. Let's delete those two methods and then create a weapon data, and I'm going to name this data. This is going to be a weapon data, so all of these are going to be in one weapon data little instance. I'm going to get a transform, and I'm going to name it firepoint. And then I'm going to need a float, and I'm going to call it cool down timer. So now let's create a public weapon, and this is going to need a weapon data, and I'm going to name it data, and it's going to need a transform, and I'm going to call it firepoint transform. Inside of here, I'm going to set data is equal to data, but since this is we assigned the same name, I'm going to put this data as weapon data, and I'm going to put data equals weapon data. Then I'm going to put firepoint is equal to firepoint transform. I'm going to set cooldown timer equal to 0. Then I'm going to create a public void named update weapon. And then inside of this method, I'm going to do my cooldown timer plus equal time.delta time. And then I'm going to check if my cooldown timer is greater than, if it is greater than or equal to my data.cooldown, then we are going to fire the weapon. So I'll create a method named fire, and then we'll call that method. Then I'm going to set cooldown timer is equal to 0. Now we have an error because fire does not exist yet. So I'm going to create that method right now. Let's create a void fire. Now inside of this, I'm going to do a for loop for int I is equal to 0. I is less than the data.projectiles per shot, and then I plus plus. So inside of this for loop, I'm going to create a game object. I'm going to name it projectile. And I'm going to set this equal instantiate. And then I need my data.prefab, my fire point dot position, and then a quaternion dot identity, so it doesn't rotate at all. Then I'm going to get a reference to the rigid body 2D named RB, and it's going to be equal to my projectile dot get component rigid body 2D. Then I want this weapon to shoot at the closest enemy, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another method that's going to return a game object, and I'm going to name it find closest enemy. Now inside of this, I'm going to create a game object array of enemies, and it's going to be equal to game object dot find game object with tag enemy. So all objects with the tag enemy will be inside of this list. And I'm going to set game object closest is equal to nothing right now. Then I'm going to get a float, and I'm going to name it minimum distance, and I'm going to set it equal to math.infinity. So we're going to do a for each game object enemy in enemies. So for each enemy in enemies, I'm going to check the float distance between the vector2 dot distance between the player and the enemy dot transform dot position. But we don't have a reference to the player yet, so I'm going to just put player here, player dot position, and then I'm going to put transform player as an argument into the find closest enemy, the find closest enemy function. Now I'm going to check if the distance is greater than the minimum distance. Then I'm going to set minimum distance equal to distance, and then closest is equal to enemy. And then at the end, I'm going to return the closest enemy. So if none are closer, then the minimum distance will always be infinity. But we have to keep on checking how many closer enemies there are between us and the closest enemy. So now, inside of this fire, we're going to have to call this find closest enemy. So I'm going to get game object target is equal to find closest enemy, and it wants the transform player. So I'm going to put just player into here, and then put transform player as an argument into this function. And then finally in the fire, I'm going to put another I'm going to put player as the argument into here, and then from update weapon, I'm going to get another transform player. And then when we call this update weapon from our weapon script, it will have a reference to the player so that we can put it inside here. So it's going to find a closest enemy, and we want that enemy. So if the target is not null, so if there is an enemy, then we are going to get our vector2 distance or direction is equal to the target dot transform dot position minus the fire point dot position, and then we're going to normalize it. Then what I'm going to do, I'm going to set RB dot linear velocity equal to direction times data.speed. Now this weapon script is finished, we need now to create a weapon manager script. So let's create another MonoBehavior script, and we're going to name it weapon manager. Now we can open up this weapon manager script. This is going to inherit from MonoBehavior because we are going to put it inside the player. So let's delete this start and update, create a public transform, and I'll name it FirePoint transform. Then let's create a public list of weapon data, and I'm going to name this starting weapons, because this is the amount of, these are the starting weapons that you will have at the beginning of the game. And we're having an error here because we need to do using system.collections.generic to be able to use the list. Now let's create the start method back up again, and then we're going to have a for each var weapon data in starting weapons. Then we're going to add a weapon, so that'll be a method, and then we're going to add the weapon data as a parameter to that method. So let's create that method quick. Let's create a public void add weapon, and it's going to take a weapon data. So now all those errors go away. Now we're going to set a weapon new weapon is equal to a new weapon with the weapon data and then the fire point. And then we're going to get equipped weapons dot add, and it's going to be our new weapon. And you can see we don't have equipped weapons yet, so let's create a public list of weapon, and I'm going to name it equipped weapons. So now we have a list of all of our equipped weapons. Now let's create the update method back up again. And then we're going to do a for each var weapon in equipped weapons. And then I'm going to do weapon.update weapon. And it's going to look for the player. So I'm just going to put transform in there. So now that that is finished, let's go back inside of the Unity editor. For our player, let's add the weapon manager. For the fire point, I'm just going to put an empty game object under the player and then put the fire point as that. I'm going to rename this game object to fire point so we know what it actually does. And then for these starting weapons, I'm going to throw this sword inside of there. So now when I click the play button, it should start our game. And you can see that we are getting a null reference exception. We are getting these null reference exceptions because we have not initialized our lists. Let's create this as a new list of weapon data. And then we need to get our equipped weapons and set it to a new list of weapon. Now, once that is finished, we can go back inside of the Unity editor. And once we're inside of the Unity editor, we can now click the play button, and we are getting another error because it says the tag enemy is not defined. So we have to go to our Ghost prefab and add a tag enemy to it. So let's create a new tag, call it enemy, and then for the ghost, we're going to put enemy on it. Once we've added that, we have to go to our sword and add a rigid body 2D component to it. I'm going to set the gravity scale to be 0, and then I'm going to click the play button. Now once we are inside of play mode, you can see that there's nothing happening, and then these swords are going towards the enemy, which is exactly what we wanted. Now, this is what we want, but I would like to have the sword to point towards the enemy. So let's now go into the weapon script, and right here inside of our target, let's create an angle. So I'm going to create a float angle and set it equal to mathf.atan2 with direction.y and direction.x times mathf.radian 2 degree. And then since our sword is pointing upwards, we're going to have to subtract 90 degrees from it. Then we're going to set our projectile.transform.rotation is equal to quaternion.euler, and then we're going to set it equal to a new vector 3 with 0, 0, and angle. Now this makes it point toward the enemy. So now I would like to have it hit the enemy. So now I'm going to go and open up the enemy logic script, and this on collision enter 2D, I'm going to check else if collision.gameObject.tag is equal to, or is if it's equal to weapon, then I'm just going to right now destroy the game object. So I'm just going to just destroy the ghost for right now. So what's going to happen now is I'm going to have to add on my sword, I'm going to have to add a box collider 2D, and then I'm going to have to add a tag to it. So I'm going to add tag, new tag, and I'm going to name it weapon. And then the sword, I'm going to add a weapon tag to it, save up this sample scene, and then before we click the play button, there's one more thing we have to do. Inside of the weapon script, I'm going to have to do both of these lines of code. I'm going to put them inside of this target if the target is not null, because if there's no enemy, we don't really want to spawn the projectile anyway. So right now, what I'm going to do is now go back inside of Unity and click the play button. Now once we are inside of play mode, we should be able to see our swords going towards it's going towards the enemies, and you can see that they are, but they're not disappearing right afterwards, which is something I would like to happen. So also in the enemy logic script, once we destroy the game object, let's also destroy the collision.gameObject. Now once we are done that, we can go back inside of Unity and then click the play button. And then we can see that this tutorial is finished because we have a working weapon that shoots a sword at an enemy and destroys the enemy, and it destroys the sword. If you like this tutorial, please give our channel a like and a subscribe because it really helps out a ton. Thank you.